In God's house, two men everyone respected made me an object for their pleasure. My own father displayed me on the altar while the pastor watched from the shadows. For years I prayed for someone to hear me, until I realized I would have to be my own salvation. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, my dears. What a joy to be here with you once again. I'm Cecilia Ann Thompson, 72 years old, and blessed with a full life. I was born in Riverdale, Nebraska, but today I live in this lovely little town of Oakwood, Minnesota, where I found my peaceful corner after life's many twists and turns. These days, my daily routine is simple and filled with love. I wake up early, before the sun rises, to prepare fresh coffee for my Robert, my life partner for 50 years. His eyesight isn't what it used to be, bless his heart, but he still insists on tending to our backyard garden, where we grow oranges, lemons, and even an avocado tree that produces the biggest avocados you've ever seen. Our house is small but cozy, with walls painted a soft yellow, a color my son Jefferson chose when he renovated everything last year. We have 3 children, you know? Jefferson, the oldest, Miriam in the middle, and Roger, our youngest. All have their own children now, giving me the blessing of being grandmother to 7 wonderful grandchildren who fill this house with joy on weekends. My day is filled with small tasks that might seem simple, but to me, they're a privilege. After breakfast with Robert, I take care of the house, prepare lunch, usually home cooking, the kind that nourishes both body and soul. In the afternoon, when Robert takes his nap, I like to sit on the front porch in a rocking chair that belonged to my mother, do some crochet, and watch the neighborhood activity. Sometimes, Miriam stops by with the children after school, and I spend time with my grandchildren while she runs errands in town. On Wednesdays, we host a group of ladies from church for our afternoon tea and prayers. They're my longtime friends, and we share not just cake recipes, but also life's joys and sorrows. It's a moment that does me so much good, you know? Because at our age, having someone to talk to is truly a gift from God. I started hosting these ladies at home about 15 years ago, after my children were grown, and I felt the house was too empty and quiet. It was Mrs. Teresa's idea, my neighbor. Cecilia, why don't we have our prayer meeting at your house? You can make that delicious cornbread with apple filling, and we'll bring the tea. And so it began, a tradition we maintain to this day. Before I continue with my story, I'd like to ask a small favor from the heart. If you're enjoying this grandma's company, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to never miss any of my stories. It helps this old lady to continue sharing her memories with you all. And you, my dears who are watching now, tell me in the comments, which town are you watching from? And what time of day did you find this video? Early morning with your coffee, after lunch during a little rest, or late at night before bed? I always read all the comments and feel so happy to know where you're from and when you take time out of your day to listen to this grandma's stories. Let me know, okay? Let's create a chain of affection. But today, I want to share something I've kept silent for many years. A difficult story, but one that needs to be told, because I know that, unfortunately, other people may be going through what I went through. It's about how appearances can be deceiving, about how people everyone respects can hide terrible secrets. It's about my youth and a dark secret that happened inside the church in my town. A secret that involved my father and the pastor, 2 men everyone believed were examples of virtue. This story begins in my adolescence, at a time when I had no idea what was to come. I was born in 1953 in Riverdale, Nebraska, a town so small that everyone knew each other by first and last name. Our house was 3 blocks from the central square, a simple wooden structure painted light blue with a large yard where my mother, Irene, grew a little bit of everything: potatoes, sweet potatoes, corn, and a blackberry bush that was the joy of all the neighborhood children in summer. My father, Alfred Thompson, was a carpenter, and one of the most respected men in the community. Tall, with an imposing bearing, he had severe brown eyes that seemed to see right through you. He always wore well-pressed shirts, even on weekdays, and on Sundays dressed in his only suit, a navy blue one that my mother cared for as if it were a sacred relic. In church, he always sat in the front pews, and his deep voice stood out during hymns, making many people turn to see who was singing with such fervor. We were 5 siblings. I was in the middle, with 2 older ones, August and Veronica, and 2 younger ones, Theodore and Carmen. August followed in our father's footsteps in carpentry. Veronica married young and moved to Minneapolis. Theodore went to seminary at 14, influenced by the appreciation our father had for the church, and Carmen, the youngest, always had fragile health, which made our mother dedicate more time to her. Our routine was simple and regulated by the clock and by faith. We woke up with the first rooster crow, around 5 in the morning. Mother was already up, lighting the wood stove to prepare breakfast, warm cornbread and coffee with milk for us children, and strong black coffee for Father. After breakfast, Father would leave for the carpentry shop 2 streets away from home, and we would go to Riverdale Elementary School. The school was an old 2-story building with a wooden staircase that creaked with every step. I remember the smell of wax on the floor that the janitors applied every Friday, and the blue and white uniform that Mother kept impeccable, even with 5 children to care for. During recess, we played tag, ring around the rosy, or hopscotch, drawn with pieces of broken brick in the dirt schoolyard. After school, we helped Mother at home. The girls learned to cook, sew, and keep house, while the boys helped in the garden or accompanied Father at the carpentry shop some afternoons. It was there, watching Mother sew our uniforms and mend family clothes, that I learned my first stitches. She had a black and gold Singer pedal machine that I keep as a treasure today. Sundays were sacred for 2 things, the 9 o'clock service and family lunch. First Baptist Church, the town's main church, was the heart of Riverdale. Built in the early century, it had colored stained glass that projected magical lights on the stone floor when the sun shone through them. The altar was carved wood, work that my father helped restore when I was about 6 years old. This brought Father very close to Pastor Frank Miller, who arrived at the parish around 1959 when I was about 6. Pastor Miller was a man of medium height, always impeccably dressed in his black suit. He had a round, ruddy face and wore thick-framed glasses that magnified his blue eyes. His voice during sermons was soft but firm, and he had a special way of making everyone feel touched by his words, as if speaking directly to each of us. He quickly became beloved by the entire community, and his friendship with my father was a source of pride for our family. "Alfred is my right-hand man," the pastor would tell everyone, "a God-fearing man like few others." And Father returned the admiration, always inviting the pastor for Sunday lunch with us, at least twice a month. These were special lunches, where Mother went all out with fried chicken and grits, typical of the region, or her special Sunday spread that included mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, gravy, and her famous apple pie, served especially on festive days. During these lunches, Pastor Miller would tell stories about his hometown, Sweetwater, Tennessee, and talk about plans for the parish. My father listened attentively and soon offered to help, whether fixing church pews, remaking the choir loft railing, or organizing church socials. And he always took one of us children to help, usually August or Theodore. I rarely went, as Father said, "Church is no place for a girl to be alone." Ironically, I later discovered the real reason for this apparent care. Life in Riverdale in the 50s and 60s was marked by seasons and religious festivals. During the summer revival, in July, the entire town participated in tent meetings, processions, and the church social, where booths sold hot cider, peanut brittle, and fresh corn. There was the greased pole where young men tried to climb to win the prize tied at the top, and the horseshoe tournament, which attracted farmers from all around. At home, we were raised with strict discipline. Father didn't allow tardiness, poorly ironed clothes, or incomplete homework. He used his belt to correct any misbehavior, especially with the boys. With us girls, he used more words, but they were so harsh that sometimes we would have preferred the belt. Girls have to be as pure as the Virgin Mary, he always said. Any stain on your reputation never comes out. Until I was 12, I believed my father was the most upright man in the world. I admired his posture in church, the respect everyone had for him, and how he was never late for anything. August and Veronica sometimes commented that he was too severe, but to me, he was just a father who wanted the best for his children. Mother, always quiet and submissive, never contradicted his decisions, even when her eyes welled up seeing one of her children being punished. It was around that age that I began to notice small changes in my father's behavior. When he returned from church after helping with maintenance, usually late at night, he brought with him a smell of whiskey that he tried to disguise with peppermint candies. His eyes looked different. There was something in them that caused me inexplicable discomfort. And he began to observe me in a strange way, especially when I changed clothes in the room I shared with my sisters and forgot to lock the door. I remember one afternoon, shortly before my 13th birthday, when I was sewing with Mother on the porch. Father arrived home from the carpentry shop earlier than usual and watched us for a while, leaning on the doorframe. Suddenly he said, "Cecilia is becoming a young lady, Irene. It's time for her to learn more about the ways of the Lord." Mother merely nodded, without raising her eyes from the fabric, but I noticed how her fingers trembled slightly as she made the next stitch. That night, I had difficulty sleeping. There was something in my father's voice, in the way his eyes followed me for the rest of the day, that left me restless. It was as if a cold wind had entered our house, announcing a storm that I couldn't yet see, but could already feel. It was on a Wednesday night, 2 weeks after my 13th birthday, that everything began. I remember it like it was yesterday. We were having dinner, beans with rice, collard greens, and some pork left over from Sunday. Father, who normally spoke little during meals, suddenly announced, "Cecilia will start accompanying me on visits to the church." Mother quickly raised her eyes, something rare for her as she usually kept her eyes lowered. "But Alfred, the girl has school early," she tried to argue in an almost inaudible voice. "Religious education is as important as book learning, Irene," Father responded dryly. "Pastor Miller and I agree that it's time she learns more deeply about the services of the Lord's house." Mother said nothing more, just nodded and looked back at her plate. Veronica, who still lived with us at that time, looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. It seemed like concern mixed with a deep sadness. That same night, after everyone had gone to bed, Father knocked on the door of the room I shared with my sisters. "Get ready, Cecilia. We're going to church." Confused, I put on a simple dress over my nightgown, combed my hair, and put on my shoes. It was almost 10 o'clock at night, a time when the church would normally be closed. When I questioned Father about this, he responded with irritation in his voice. "God's servant can enter the Lord's house at any hour, and I have the key that Pastor Miller entrusted to me for maintenance." The walk to church was silent. The streets of Riverdale were deserted at that hour, lit only by the few yellow streetlights. The sky was overcast without stars, and a cold wind blew, making the dry leaves dance on the ground. I remember hugging myself, feeling a shiver that wasn't just from the cold of the night. The First Baptist Church looked different in the darkness. Its steeple rose like shadows against the sky, and the stained glass, without the sunlight to pass through them, were just dark spots on the walls. Father unlocked the side door, the one that gave access to the sacristy, and we entered. The creak of the door echoed through the empty space, making my heart race. Inside the church, only a few votive candles near the altar were lit, creating shadows that danced on the walls. The smell of wax and incense filled the air. Father lit 2 more candles and placed them on the altar. "Come here, Cecilia," he called, his voice sounding strangely loud in the silence of the sacred place. I approached slowly, feeling my knees tremble without understanding why. There was something in his look, something I had never seen before. "Do you know why we're here?" he asked, while placing his hands on my shoulders. To pray, Father? I responded uncertainly. He smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was something different, which made my stomach contract. We're here for you to learn about humility and obedience before God, he said, gripping my shoulders with more force. The body is a temple, but also a source of sin. You're growing up, becoming a woman, and need to learn to purify yourself. Confused and frightened, I stayed silent, not understanding what he meant. It was then that Father took a step back and said the words that would mark the beginning of my nightmare. "Remove your dress, Cecilia." "What, Father?" I asked, thinking I had heard wrong. "Remove the dress. Here, in God's house, you will learn to be ashamed of your sinful body." My eyes filled with tears as I stood paralyzed, unable to comprehend what was happening. "But Father, why?" "Don't question." He raised his voice, making it echo off the church walls. "Eve questioned God and brought sin into the world. You will learn to obey without questioning." With trembling hands and silent tears running down my face, I began to unbutton the simple blue cotton dress. Shame burned my face as I stood only in my undergarments in front of the altar. Father's gaze traveled over me from head to toe, making me feel dirty in a way I had never felt before. "Now kneel and pray," he ordered, pointing to the altar. "Pray for God to forgive the vanity and lust that begin to grow in you." I knelt on the cold stone floor, shivering from cold and fear. Tears blurred my vision as I tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. How could God want this? How could my father, the man everyone respected, make me go through such humiliation? While I was kneeling, I heard a subtle noise coming from the sacristy. A movement, a contained sigh, something that made me turn my head quickly. For an instant, I had the impression of seeing a shadow moving, as if someone was watching. But the sacristy was too dark to be sure. "Don't get distracted," Father's voice cut through my thoughts. "You are before God." We stayed like this for almost an hour, me kneeling, praying amid silent sobs, and my father standing, observing me with that look I had never seen before. When he finally allowed me to put my dress back on, my legs were numb and my knees bruised from prolonged contact with the stone floor. On the way back home, Father spoke only once. "This will happen every week. It's for your own good, for your purification, and don't you dare tell anyone, especially your mother. This is between you, me, and God." That night, I couldn't sleep. Lying in the bed I shared with Carmen, I looked at the wooden ceiling, trying to understand what had happened. Beside me, my younger sister slept peacefully, unaware of the horror I had just experienced. I wanted to tell someone, ask for help, but who? Mother lived under Father's yoke as much as we children did. My older siblings no longer lived at home. And in small Riverdale, Nebraska, the word of Alfred Thompson was worth more than that of anyone else, especially that of a 13-year-old girl. The following week, it happened again. And the next one, too. Each visit to the church became more difficult than the previous one. Father began to demand that I remove my undergarments as well, leaving only my intimate clothes. "Shame purifies the soul," he would say, while observing me kneeling, exposed and humiliated. It was on the third visit that I was certain we weren't alone. While praying, looking fixedly at the crucifix on the altar to avoid my father's gaze, I again heard that subtle noise coming from the sacristy. This time, when I quickly turned my head, I could clearly see. The sacristy door was ajar, and through the crack a pair of eyes was watching us. They were the blue eyes, magnified by the thick-framed glasses of Pastor Miller. My blood froze in my veins. The pastor, the man who should be God's representative on earth, was there, hidden, watching my humiliation. It wasn't just my father, it was both of them, united in a perverse pact that profaned the very place they should protect. When our gazes met, he quickly retreated into the shadows. But I knew what I had seen, and that certainty hit me like a punch to the stomach. The two figures of maximum authority in my life My father and the pastor were betraying me in the most cruel way possible. "Father," I whispered, still looking at the sacristy door, "there's someone there." My father followed my gaze, and to my surprise, smiled. It wasn't a smile of shame or guilt, but of satisfaction. "It's just Pastor Miller," he answered naturally. "He's praying for your soul." At that moment, I understood the extent of the horror. It wasn't a secret my father kept from the pastor. It was a secret they shared. A silent agreement where my father exercised power over me, and the pastor observed, hidden in the shadows of the sacristy. The nighttime visits to the church continued for weeks, then months. Always the same ritual. Me, forced to be without clothes, kneeling in forced prayer, my father openly observing, and the pastor, hidden but present. With each visit, I felt a part of me dying, the faith I once had shattering like the pieces of a broken stained glass window. At school, my performance began to decline. I couldn't concentrate. I fell asleep during classes after sleepless nights. The teachers noticed the change, but attributed it to the tiredness of age or the difficult phase of adolescence. At home, I became quiet and withdrawn. I avoided being alone with my father and would shrink when he approached. Mother noticed the change in my behavior. One afternoon, while we were washing clothes together at the backyard sink, she gently touched my arm. "Is something happening, my daughter?" she asked, her eyes revealing genuine concern. I wanted to tell everything, to throw out the weight of that horrible secret. But at the exact moment I opened my mouth to speak, I saw Father standing at the back door, watching us with those eyes that now caused me so much terror. The message was clear. He was always vigilant, always ready to ensure my silence. "It's nothing, Mother," I answered, lowering my eyes to the soapy clothes. "I just haven't been sleeping well." At night, lying in bed, I began to plan an escape. Maybe I could go to Minneapolis, find my sister Veronica, or perhaps to Chicago, where a cousin of Mother's lived. But how could a 13-year-old girl, then 14, 15 years old, travel alone? Where would I get money for the ticket? And even if I managed to escape, the word of Alfred Thompson would arrive before me, painting me as an ungrateful and lying daughter. It was when I turned 16 that things got even worse. In one of the nighttime visits to the church, Pastor Miller was no longer content to observe from the shadows. He came out of the sacristy and came to the altar, standing next to my father. "Cecilia is becoming a woman," he said to my father, without even looking at me, as if I were an object being evaluated. "The humiliation is working. She is learning the necessary submission." My father nodded, proud, as if they were discussing the progress of a carpentry project and not the systematic destruction of my dignity and faith. It was on that night that, for the first time, the pastor also gave me direct orders, telling me to stand in different positions for better contemplation of sin. The horror now had two faces, two voices, two pairs of eyes watching me. The place that should have been sacred, the church where I was baptized and had my first communion, had been transformed into the chamber of my personal torment. And the two people who should protect me, my father by the nature of blood, the pastor by the duty of his office, were my tormentors. I began to get sick frequently. Unexplainable fevers, stomach pains, nightmares that made me wake up screaming in the middle of the night. My body was manifesting what my voice couldn't express. Mother took me to the doctor in Lincoln, a larger city near Riverdale, but the exams showed nothing physical. "It's nerves," said the doctor, prescribing a mild sedative. The nerves, of course, had a name and surname. They had the face of my father and Pastor Miller. They had the echo of their footsteps in the empty church at night. They had the cold of the stone floor on my bruised knees. One night, after another session of humiliation in the church, I made a desperate decision. I couldn't continue living like this. If I couldn't escape, if I couldn't speak, perhaps I could end everything in another way. The next day, I took some of the sedative pills the doctor had prescribed and hid them under the mattress. Each day, I saved one or two, accumulating enough for what I planned to do. But fate, or perhaps God, the real one, not the one my father and the pastor distorted, had other plans for me. The morning after the day I decided I would take all the pills at once, the announcement that would change everything arrived in Riverdale. The regional church director, Reverend James Evans, would make a visit to the parish for a special confirmation service. The announcement of the director's visit lit a small flame of hope in me. Reverend Evans was known throughout the region as a just and severe man who did not tolerate misconduct in the clergy. His visits to parishes were rare and always caused a commotion. It was as if a general was coming to inspect the troops. Pastor Miller, normally so sure of himself, seemed nervous in the services that followed the announcement. "The director will arrive in 3 weeks," he informed us one Sunday, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "We need to prepare everything to receive him with the dignity he deserves." I observed how my father and the pastor exchanged tense looks after the announcement. Something about the authority that Reverend Evans represented worried them, and that concern lit in me the first spark of a plan. Meanwhile, the nighttime visits to the church continued, now with a renewed cruelty, as if the two men felt that their power over me was somehow threatened. On one of those nights, when autumn was already cooling the air of Riverdale, something inside me broke completely. "Today you will be completely bare," ordered my father, his voice carrying that tone I had learned to fear. "No, Father, please," I begged, hugging my own body as if I could protect myself. "It's too cold, and this is—" I didn't finish the sentence. The slap came quick and strong, hitting my face with such force that I staggered backwards, almost falling. "You dare to disobey?" he roared, grabbing my arm with enough force to leave marks. "Who do you think you are to question?" Pastor Miller, who was observing from the dimness, took a step forward. His normally ruddy face was pale, but his eyes shone with a disturbing intensity. "Alfred," he said, his voice falsely gentle, "remember that we are in God's house. Physical violence is not necessary. The girl will learn." He turned to me, and for the first time addressed me directly with that tone he used in Sunday sermons, but now distorted by something terrible. "Cecilia, disobedience is the worst of sins. That's how Eve fell, and that's how all women fall. Do you want to fall into sin?" Trembling uncontrollably, both from cold and fear, I shook my head negatively. "Then prove your obedience," he continued, looking at my clothes. "Prove that you want to be saved." With tears running down my face and a knot in my throat that barely let me breathe, I began to remove my clothes piece by piece. First the dress, then the undergarments, finally the intimate pieces, until I was completely exposed under the gaze of the two men. The cold of the church penetrated my skin, but it was the inner cold that consumed me, a frozen emptiness where once there had been innocence and faith. "Now kneel and pray," ordered my father, his voice low and hoarse. I knelt on the stone floor, my knees already calloused from so many similar nights. I closed my eyes tightly, not wanting to see the looks that traveled over my body, and began to mutter automatic prayers, empty words that no longer had meaning for me. At that moment, I heard Pastor Miller approach. He stopped right in front of me and said, "Open your eyes, Cecilia. Look at the crucifix while you pray." I opened my eyes reluctantly, only to discover that he had positioned himself in such a way that I had to look at him, not at the altar, while praying. His face was a few inches from mine, and there was something in his eyes that made me want to scream, but no sound came from my throat. "Do you understand what we're doing here, don't you?" he asked, his voice just a whisper. "We're saving your soul. The body is just sinful flesh. It needs to be humiliated for the soul to rise." While he spoke, I realized that my father had moved away, going towards the main door of the church. I heard the click of the lock. He was locking us inside the temple. "Your father gave me permission to intensify your purification," continued the pastor, now placing an icy hand on my shoulder. From today, we will deepen your learning. The terror I felt at that moment is something I can't completely describe. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the church, as if the walls themselves were about to collapse on me. For an instant, I considered running, screaming, fighting. But to where? To whom? Who would believe my word against that of the esteemed Pastor Miller and the respected Alfred Thompson? What happened next remains in my memory as fragmented flashes, distorted images that my mind tried to block to protect me. I remember the pastor's hands, cold as a corpse's, touching me with a pretense of solemnity, as if he were performing some profane ritual. I remember his mumbled prayers while committing those atrocities, using God's name to justify the unjustifiable. I remember my father returning later, observing with an expression that mixed satisfaction and something that only many years later I recognized as guilt. I remember returning home that night, feeling completely empty, as if there was nothing left inside me but a large black hole that consumed everything: hope, faith, dignity. In the days that followed, I couldn't look my mother in the eyes. How could I? What words could express the horror I was living? And even if I found the words, what guarantee did I have that I would be believed? In Riverdale, the word of a teenager was worth nothing against that of a respected family father and a beloved pastor. My health deteriorated drastically. I stopped eating, losing so much weight that my clothes hung on my body like on a hanger. At night, the nightmares were so intense that I would wake up screaming, frightening Carmen, who began to ask to sleep in Mother's room. During the day, I wandered like a ghost through the house and school, present only in body, my mind always distant, seeking an escape that didn't exist. It was Mrs. Clyde, my English teacher, who first noticed the seriousness of the situation. One day, after class, she called me to talk. "Cecilia, what's happening to you?" she asked, her kind eyes showing genuine concern. I wanted to tell. I wanted to pour out all that poison that was corroding me from inside. But the words got stuck in my throat. Years of forced silence and fear had taught me to distrust even kindness. "I'm just tired, teacher," I replied, avoiding her gaze. "Cecilia," she insisted, placing her hand on my shoulder, which made me instinctively recoil. "Whatever is happening, you can count on me. I'm here to help." Those simple words, that sincere offer of help, almost broke my resolution of silence. Almost. But then I remembered what had happened the night before in the church, and fear was stronger. "Thank you, teacher," I murmured, before quickly leaving the room, leaving Mrs. Clyde with an expression of helplessness that added to my own pains. The visits to the church continued, now with increasing cruelty. The pastor, having crossed all the limits of the sacred, seemed increasingly bold in his purifications. My father, at times, seemed uncomfortable with Pastor Miller's excesses, but never enough to interrupt that diabolical pact they had established. One night, while I was dressing after another session of horror, I heard the two talking in low voices near the altar. "I'm worried about the director's visit," the pastor was saying. "Reverend Evans has a reputation for being very rigorous. If he discovers—" "Nobody is going to discover anything," my father responded firmly. "Who would believe her word against ours? We are respected men in the community." "Even so," insisted the pastor, "we need to be more careful in the coming weeks. No visible marks, and maybe it's better to suspend our sessions until the director leaves." My father seemed to consider for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. Let's take a break. The girl isn't going anywhere. We can resume later." That conversation, overheard by chance, planted the seed of my plan. They were afraid of the director. There was someone whose authority they feared, and this was my chance, perhaps the only one I would have. The following week, as agreed between them, there was no nighttime visit to the church. It was the first breath I had in years. I used every minute of that temporary truce to plan, to gather courage. I wouldn't be able to speak directly with the director. I knew I would be prevented. But perhaps I could write, leave a note, something that would reach his hands without my father or the pastor knowing. I began to write a letter, hidden under the covers late at night, using the weak light coming through the window. At first, the words wouldn't come. How to describe the indescribable? How to put the horrors lived on paper without dying of shame? But gradually, like a trickle of water breaking a dam, the words began to flow. Reverend Evans, I wrote with trembling hands. My name is Cecilia Ann Thompson. I am 17 years old, and I am the daughter of Alfred Thompson. What I am about to tell is difficult, but it is the truth before God. I described everything, sparing no details. The nighttime visits to the church, the humiliation, the abuses, the pact between my father and the pastor. Each word I wrote was like pulling a thorn from the soul, painful, but necessary for healing. I finished the letter begging for help, for intervention, for justice. I know I may not be believed, I concluded, but I ask that you, as a representative of God, investigate. Observe how Pastor Miller acts around young girls. Ask the other girls of the parish if he has ever invited them for private conversations in the sacristy. The truth will appear. I folded the letter several times and hid it inside the lining of my Sunday dress, the one I would wear for the special service with the director. Now I just needed to wait and pray. No longer to the distorted God of my father and the pastor, but to a God of justice that I hoped still existed somewhere. The wait was agonizing. Each day seemed to drag on. Each night brought with it the fear that my father would change his mind and resume the visits to the church before the director's arrival. My mother, noticing my growing agitation, tried to calm me in her silent way. Preparing my favorite dishes, arranging my hair with special care, small gestures that said what she couldn't express in words. One afternoon, while helping Mother hang clothes on the clothesline in the backyard, she got closer than normal and whispered, so low I almost didn't hear, "Whatever you're planning, be careful, my daughter." I looked at her surprised, seeing in her eyes a knowledge she had never admitted. Did she know? Had she always known, and like me, was trapped in a web of fear and silence? "Mother," I began, but she shook her head slightly, indicating we shouldn't talk there. Later, when we were alone in the kitchen preparing dinner, she continued in a low voice, "Your father is not the man everyone thinks he is. I've known that for a long time." She paused, kneading the bread dough with more force than necessary. "I can't protect you as I should. I never could. But I want you to know that, whatever happens, I am on your side." Those words, that small confession, were like a balm for my wounded soul. I wasn't completely alone. My mother, in her way limited by the circumstances of her own life, was with me. On the eve of the director's arrival, I couldn't sleep. I spent the night mentally reviewing every detail of the plan. The letter was safe, hidden where no one would find it before the time. All I needed to do was get close enough to the director during the service to deliver it directly into his hands. But what if I couldn't? What if my father or the pastor realized what I was doing? Fear consumed me, bringing with it nausea that made me run to the bathroom several times during the night. When the sun finally rose, I was exhausted but determined. That would be the day when the silence would end. The news of Reverend Evans' arrival spread quickly through the small Riverdale. Around 10 in the morning, a black and shiny car, very different from the simple vehicles of the town, parked in front of the parish house. The director had arrived. From our house, I could see the movement in the central square. People gathered to welcome the important visitor, wearing their best clothes even though it wasn't Sunday. Pastor Miller, with his red and sweaty face, seemed nervous as he received his superior. Reverend Evans was a tall, thin man with completely white hair and a face marked by deep wrinkles that gave him an air of severe wisdom. He wore the complete vestments of his position, which made him even more imposing. Next to him, Pastor Miller seemed diminished, almost insignificant. The The special service would be held at 5 in the afternoon. Throughout the day, the excitement in the town grew. The women prepared treats for the reception that would follow the celebration. The men helped decorate the church with flowers and ribbons. It was as if an extraordinary event was about to happen. And indeed it was, though not in the way everyone imagined. When it was time to get ready for the service, I felt my stomach twisting in knots. I carefully put on my Sunday dress, making sure the letter remained secure in its hiding place. I combed my hair, tied it with ribbons, trying to look as normal as possible, though my heart was beating so hard it seemed like everyone could hear it. "Are you okay?" asked Carmen, noticing my paleness. "You look sick." "I'm fine," I replied automatically, the same answer I had been giving for years, even when I was broken inside. My father entered the room without knocking, as usual. "Are you ready?" he asked, his tone impatient. "I don't want to be late for the director's service." There was something in his eyes, a restlessness that I immediately recognized. Despite his words to the pastor, he was considering resuming the nighttime visits to the church. The truce was near its end. It was today or never. The First Baptist Church had never been so full. People from all over Riverdale, and even from neighboring towns, came for the special service presided over by Reverend Evans. The air was charged with expectation, the murmur of conversations filling the normally silent space. Our family arrived 20 minutes before the start of the celebration, my father insisting on sitting in the first row, as always. "We are important members of this community," he would repeat whenever someone questioned his insistence on being so far forward. Today, that proximity would serve my purpose. Sitting between my mother and my sister Carmen, I was trembling so much that I had to hold my hands in my lap to disguise it. The letter seemed to burn inside the lining of my dress, a secret about to explode. I looked around, trying to appear casual, looking for the best moment to approach the director. Pastor Miller circulated through the church, visibly nervous, adjusting flower arrangements, checking if everything was perfect to impress his superior. When he passed by our bench, he gave me a quick but significant look, a silent reminder of the power he exercised over me, a veiled threat for me to maintain silence. At his side, walking with the solemnity of his position, was Reverend Evans, greeting the faithful with a nod of his head. Up close, he seemed even more imposing. He had perceptive eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances and a severe expression that inspired more respect than affection. "That's the director," whispered Carmen at my side, impressed with the elaborate vestments. "Yes," replied my father, leaning forward. "And after the service, I will be introduced to him. Pastor Miller will make a point of mentioning all the work I've done for the parish." His tone was one of pride, as if he were about to receive a medal for good services, not as someone who should fear judgment for his acts. That arrogance, that certainty of impunity, was the last straw. At that moment, any hesitation I still might have had disappeared. He needed to be stopped. Both of them needed to be, and I would be the instrument of that justice. The service began punctually at 5 o'clock. The hymns filled the church, voices united in praises that once meant so much to me, but now sounded empty after everything I had experienced inside those walls. I observed Reverend Evans presiding over the celebration, his strong and clear voice echoing under the vaulted ceiling. At his side, Pastor Miller seemed like a boy caught in mischief, always looking sideways at his superior as if fearing being discovered at any moment. During the sermon, Reverend Evans spoke about integrity, about how God's representatives on earth should be immaculate examples of virtue. "Hypocrisy is one of the worst sins," he declared, his voice thundering through the church. "Those who use the mantle of faith to hide impure actions will be judged more severely, for they betray not only men, but God himself." I saw Pastor Miller gulp, his normally ruddy face now pale as wax. At my side, my father shifted uncomfortably on the bench. Were they feeling the weight of their consciences? Or did they just fear that their secrets might come to light? The time for communion arrived. the moment I had been waiting for. As the faithful formed a line to receive the host, my trembling hand found the hidden letter. With a discreet movement, I removed it from its hiding place and held it firmly. Our row stood up to join the line. My father went in front, followed by Mother, then me and Carmen last. The path to the altar never seemed so long. Each step was a conscious effort not to crumble under the weight of that decision. In front of me, Mother looked back briefly, and our gazes met. Something in her eyes told me she knew, that somehow she could feel what was about to happen. When my father knelt before the director to receive communion, I could see how he lowered his head in a demonstration of false piety that turned my stomach. Then it was Mother's turn, who received the host with a silent reverence. Then came my turn. I knelt before Reverend Evans, looking directly into his eyes. Something in my gaze must have communicated the urgency, the desperation, for he held his gaze fixed on mine for a moment longer than normal. "The body of Christ," he said, extending the host. "Amen," I replied, receiving the host with my left hand, while with my right, in a quick but precise movement, I slid the folded letter into the sleeve of his vestment. I saw his eyes widen slightly in surprise, but he made no movement to prevent or reveal my gesture. I quickly stood up and returned to the bench, my heart beating so hard that I feared everyone could hear it. Back in my place, I couldn't pray. I just fixed my gaze on the altar, observing Reverend Evans continue to distribute communion. At one point, I saw his free hand discreetly touch the sleeve where I had placed the letter, as if to confirm that something really was there. At my side, my father seemed at peace, absorbed in his prayers, completely unaware of what I had just done. The rest of the service passed like a blur. My hands were icy, my mouth dry, my mind alternating between the terror of what could happen if my plan went wrong and the desperate hope that finally someone would hear me. After the final blessing, Reverend Evans announced that he would receive greetings from the faithful at the parish house, where a small reception would also be served. My father, eager to impress the director, insisted that the whole family go. "It's an honor to be received by the director," he declared, adjusting his tie as we left the church. At the parish house, the tension within me grew with each minute. The place was full, people crowding to speak with Reverend Evans, who received everyone with a contained but polite smile. I observed him from afar, noticing how, at a certain moment, he discreetly moved away to a side room. Minutes later, he returned with a different expression, more serious, more concentrated. His eyes scanned the room until they found mine. For the briefest moment, our gazes crossed, and I felt that he had read my letter. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know if from fear or relief. "Pastor Miller," Reverend Evans' voice cut through the buzz of the room like a knife. "I need to speak with you in private. Now." The tone admitted no refusal. Pastor Miller, who was animatedly conversing with some influential members of the community, stopped in the middle of a sentence. His face, already naturally ruddy, acquired an almost purple tone. "Of course, Reverend," he replied, trying to maintain his composure, but his voice betrayed his nervousness. The two retired to the office of the parish house, leaving behind a momentary silence, followed by a murmur of curiosity. What could be so urgent? Why did the director seem so serious? My father, who was observing the scene from nearby, frowned. Something in his instinct must have sounded an alarm, for he began to look around, as if searching for something, or someone, out of place. His eyes eventually rested on me, and in that instant, I knew he suspected. "What did you do?" he hissed, quickly approaching and grabbing my arm with enough force to leave marks. "What did you tell them?" Before I could respond, the office door opened again. Reverend Evans reappeared, his face a mask of gravity. At his side, Pastor Miller seemed to have aged 10 years in a matter of minutes, pale, trembling, defeated. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Reverend Evans, his firm and authoritative voice instantly silencing the room, "I ask that everyone leave, except the Thompson family. I have an urgent matter to discuss with Mr. Alfred and his family." A murmur of surprise went through the room. No one knew what was happening, but everyone felt that something extraordinary was about to occur. Reluctantly, the guests began to leave, casting curious glances in our direction. When the last guest left and the door closed, only us remained. My family, the director, and a visibly disturbed Pastor Miller. The silence that followed was dense, almost suffocating. "Mr. Thompson," began Reverend Evans, his voice now icy, "I received today very serious information about your conduct and Pastor Miller's that, if true, constitutes not only a mortal sin, but also a crime before the laws of men." My father turned pale, but quickly regained his composure. "I don't know what your reverence is talking about," he replied, with forced confidence. Reverend Evans took my letter from the pocket of his vestment and held it up. "This letter, written by your daughter Cecilia, contains accusations of a nature so grave that they left me deeply disturbed. Pastor Miller has already partially confessed his participation in the acts described here." All eyes turned to me. My father's was of pure hatred, my mother's of a pain mixed with a strange relief, Carmen's of confusion and fear. Pastor Miller's was the most difficult to decipher, a mixture of shame, anger, and something that seemed almost relief. "She's lying!" exploded my father, taking a step in my direction, his fists clenched. "She's a rebellious girl who has always caused problems. She invented this story to harm us." Reverend Evans interposed himself between us, his tall and imposing figure like a barrier. "Don't approach her," he ordered, with an authority that made my father retreat. "Pastor Miller has already admitted that you took the girl to the church during the night. He said it was for special prayers. But his hesitation and his behavior tell me something else." My father looked at the pastor with disbelief, as if he had been betrayed. "You told him? You broke our agreement?" Those words were his condemnation. The involuntary confession hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. "So it's true," said Reverend Evans, his voice now trembling with indignation. "You really—" He couldn't finish the sentence, as if the words were too horrible to be pronounced. It was at that moment that something inside me broke completely. Years of forced silence, of humiliation, of suppressed pain, everything exploded in a scream that seemed to come from the depths of my soul. "It's true! Everything is true!" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "They took me to the church at night. Father forced me to remove everything in front of the altar, said it was to purify me. And the pastor would hide, watching everything. Then he began to participate too." I couldn't continue. Sobs shook my body with such force that I could barely stand. Mother ran to me, enveloping me in her thin but surprisingly strong arms. My daughter," she repeated, crying too. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me help?" "He said he would kill you if I told," I replied between sobs. "Said no one would believe me, that everyone would think I was a liar, a sinner." Reverend Evans watched the scene with a mixture of horror and compassion. Then, turning to my father and the pastor, his face hardened again. "Alfred Thompson, from this moment you are forbidden from entering any church in this region. As for you, Pastor Miller, you are suspended from all your pastoral duties until further notice. Tomorrow itself I will communicate the case to the civil authorities. What you did is not only a mortal sin, it is a crime that must be punished by the laws of men." My father, seeing his world crumble, made one last desperate effort. "You're going to believe the word of a disturbed girl against mine, against that of a pastor? No one in town will believe this. No one." "I believe it," said my mother, her voice surprisingly firm. "I always knew something was wrong. Her nightmares, the fear, the changes. How could I be so cowardly? How could I not see what was before my eyes?" "And I also believe it," added a voice from the door. It was Mrs. Clyde, my teacher. She was pale, trembling, but determined. "For months I've noticed the changes in Cecilia. I tried to talk to her, but there was always a barrier of fear. Now I understand why. I don't know how she knew what was happening, how she arrived at that crucial moment. Perhaps she heard rumors about the private meeting. Perhaps she was guided by some intuition. What matters is that she was there, one more voice to join mine, one more witness against the wall of silence that had imprisoned me for so long. My father, finding himself cornered, resorted to the last weapon he had always used so well: violence. With a roar of fury, he advanced toward me, fists raised, face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. "You'll regret this, you ungrateful. I'll teach you to keep your mouth shut." Everything happened very quickly. Reverend Evans tried to intercept him, but wasn't fast enough. My mother placed herself in front of me, trying to protect me. My father's fist hit her face with a horrible sound I will never forget. She fell, blood running from her nose. That scene, my mother fallen, blood staining her best dress, finally defending me at the cost of her own safety, was the final point. Something inside me, which had been silenced by years of abuse, finally found its voice. "Enough!" I shouted with a strength I didn't know I possessed. "It's over, Father. Your power over me, over Mother, over all of us is over. You are not the good man everyone thinks. You are a monster, and now everyone will know." My scream seemed to paralyze him. He looked around, as if suddenly realizing the consequences of what he had done, of what had been revealed. His empire of respect and admiration, built on lies, was crumbling before his eyes. With a last look of hatred in my direction, he ran to the door and disappeared into the night. That night marked the end of my nightmare and the beginning of a new battle, the battle for truth, for justice, and for my own recovery. But for the first time in years, as I helped my mother to stand up, as I received the support of Mrs. Clyde and the protection of Reverend Evans, I felt something I had forgotten: hope. The small seed of courage that I planted when writing that letter had finally germinated, breaking the hard soil of fear and silence. And although the path ahead was uncertain and certainly difficult, I was no longer alone. The truth, as painful as it was, had finally come to light. The days following the confrontation at the parish house were a whirlwind. My father had disappeared on the night of the revelation, fleeing like the coward he was beneath that facade of a respectable man. Pastor Miller was immediately removed from his duties and taken by Reverend Evans to the regional headquarters in Omaha, where he would remain until the ecclesiastical and civil authorities decided his fate. For me and my mother, a difficult but liberating journey began. At dawn the next day, we were still at the parish house, where we had spent the night under Reverend Evans' protection. My mother had a swollen face from the blow she had received, but there was a determination in her eyes that I had never seen before. "We can't go back to that house," she said, holding my hands between hers, "not after everything that happened there." "But where will we go, Mother?" I asked, feeling the weight of uncertainty upon us. It was Mrs. Clyde who offered us the first shelter. "Come to my house," she said firmly. "I have an extra room, and you can stay as long as necessary." That teacher, whom I had always admired for her intelligence and kindness, became the first person to extend a hand when we needed it most. Her small apartment above the Central Pharmacy of Riverdale became our temporary refuge. But the situation was complex. As we moved to Mrs. Clyde's house, news of the scandal spread through small Riverdale like wildfire through dry straw. In a matter of hours, the whole town knew that Alfred Thompson and Pastor Miller had been accused of terrible acts against me. The reactions were mixed. Some people, especially the women of the town, came to offer us discreet support. Others, incredulous, looked at us with distrust in the streets. "How can a girl make such accusations against such respectable men?" I heard someone murmur in the market. The worst came when Carmen returned from school crying because the other children were calling her the liar's sister. Theodore, my brother who was at the seminary, sent a cold letter saying he couldn't believe I had defamed a man of God, and that he was praying for my soul. Only August, my older brother, and Veronica, my sister who lived in Minneapolis, offered unrestricted support when they learned what had happened. Veronica, in fact, came to visit us as soon as she knew, bringing with her not just emotional comfort, but also a proposal. "You can't continue here," she said, sitting in the small living room of Mrs. Clyde. "People will always look at you as those from the church scandal. Come to Minneapolis with me. It's a big city. Nobody knows you there. You can start over." The idea of starting over in a place where no one knew us was tempting, but also frightening. How to leave behind everything we knew? How to rebuild our lives from zero? The decision was made by circumstances that were beyond our control. 3 weeks after the confrontation, a court officer knocked on Mrs. Clyde's door with a paper in his hands. It was a summons. My mother and I should appear at the courthouse in Lincoln to testify in the case against my father and Pastor Miller. Lincoln was almost 3 hours from Riverdale, and the courthouse was an imposing building that intimidated me as soon as I saw it. Inside it, in a cold and austere room, I gave my testimony before a judge with a severe expression but compassionate eyes. For hours, I had to relive every detail of that nightmare while a clerk typed on a typewriter, recording my suffering in black letters on white paper. My mother also testified, telling how she always suspected something was wrong, but how fear and years of submission prevented her from acting. Her testimony, although painful for her, was crucial to corroborate my story. At the end of the hearing, the judge informed us that an arrest warrant had been issued for my father, but that he had not yet been located. As for Pastor Miller, he was in the custody of the church, awaiting judgment by the ecclesiastical tribunal, but would also answer criminally when the process advanced. "And what about us?" my mother asked the prosecutor, a young man with a compassionate look. "Can we return to our house?" "Technically, yes," he replied. "But I recommend caution. Not everyone in town believes your version. It could be uncomfortable." Uncomfortable was an understatement. When we returned to Riverdale that night, we found our house with broken windows and horrible words painted on the facade. Someone had tried to set fire to the porch, but the neighbors had managed to put out the fire before it spread. It was the last straw. That same night, sitting around Mrs. Clyde's table, we made the decision. We would go to Minneapolis with Veronica. "I have a small but cozy apartment," said my sister. "There's enough space for the 3 of us, and I know a textile factory that's hiring. Mother could work there. And you, Cecilia, could finish your studies at a different school where no one knows your story." The prospect of a new beginning, away from the shadows of the past, finally lit a small flame of hope in my heart. It was frightening, yes, but also liberating. The next morning, we began to pack the little we had managed to save from our house. As we folded clothes and separated the few objects of sentimental value, Carmen, who had been strangely quiet, finally spoke. "I still don't understand why Father did that to you, Cecilia." The room fell silent. How to explain to a 12-year-old girl the evil that exists in the world? How to make her understand something that even I didn't completely comprehend? "Some people, even those who seem good on the outside, have darkness inside them," Mother replied, saving me from having to find words. "Your father, he wasn't the man he pretended to be all these years. But what now? Will he never come back?" asked Carmen, her voice small and fragile. "I don't know, my daughter," Mother replied honestly. "But for now, we have to think about building a new life for ourselves." 3 days later, we left for Minneapolis on an interstate bus. We carried only 2 suitcases each, containing all that remained of our previous lives. Looking through the window as the bus left Riverdale, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. I was leaving behind the scene of my worst nightmare, but also the only home I had ever known. The journey was long and silent. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, trying to process everything that had happened and imagine what the future held for us. For me, at 17 years old, it was as if I were being born again, frightening, but also full of possibilities. Minneapolis received us with the anonymity we so needed. It was a growing city, full of people from all corners of the country seeking new opportunities. Veronica's apartment was on the third floor of a modest but well-maintained building near downtown. It had only 2 bedrooms, so Carmen and I shared one while Mother slept with Veronica. The first months were of adaptation. Mother got the job at the textile factory that Veronica had mentioned. The work was arduous and the salary modest, but she seemed to find a strange satisfaction in earning her own money for the first time in her life. Carmen was enrolled in a nearby school and, after some initial resistance, began to make friends. I, following Veronica's advice, enrolled to finish high school at a state school. But the transition wasn't easy. At night, nightmares still haunted me. During the day, any man who vaguely resembled my father or Pastor Miller made me freeze in fear. At school, I had difficulty concentrating, and my new English teacher, a middle-aged lady named Mrs. Eunice, frequently caught me looking out the window, lost in dark thoughts. It was Mrs. Eunice who, noticing my silent struggle, referred me to the school psychologist, Dr. Lydia. Initially, I resisted the idea of telling my story to yet another person, but Mrs. Eunice insisted. "Some wounds need air to heal," she said gently. Reluctantly, I began to have weekly sessions with Dr. Lydia, a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a calm voice. At first, I could barely talk about what had happened. The words got stuck in my throat, and I spent most of the session in silence, looking at my hands. But Dr. Lydia was patient. "There's no rush," she would say. "I'll be here when you're ready." It was during the 6th session that something broke inside me. A simple question. "How do you feel today, Cecilia?" And suddenly, the words began to pour out, along with tears I didn't even know I still had to shed. I told everything, every sordid detail, every night of terror, every feeling of powerlessness and shame. When I finished, exhausted and with my throat sore from so much crying, Dr. Lydia simply said, "You are the bravest person I've ever met, Cecilia." Those words, so simple but so profound, planted the first real seed of healing in my heart. If this woman, who heard difficult stories every day, thought I was brave, perhaps there was something of value in me after all. The sessions with Dr. Lydia continued, becoming a safe harbor in my new life. Slowly, I began to process the trauma, to understand that what happened wasn't my fault, that I had nothing to be ashamed of. Meanwhile, life in Minneapolis followed its course. Veronica introduced us to some of her friends, and we began to build a small support network. Mother, for the first time in her life, was making her own choices, discovering who she was outside the dominating shadow of my father. It was at one of these small social gatherings, a barbecue in the backyard of a colleague of Veronica's, that I met Robert. He was a few years older than me, an engineering student at the local university, with a shy smile and eyes that seemed to see through the masks we all wear. Our first meeting was brief, just a casual conversation while we served our plates. But there was something about him, a gentleness without demands, that intrigued me. When he asked if he could see me again, I was surprised at myself for saying yes. Our first date was a walk in the city park, followed by a coffee at an unpretentious diner. We talked about books, movies, dreams for the future, light, safe subjects. But there were moments when our gazes met, and I felt that he perceived there was more to my story than I was sharing. It was on the 3rd date that I finally told him. We were sitting on a park bench watching the sunset, when suddenly I felt the need to be honest. If this nascent relationship was going anywhere, he needed to know who I was, what I had lived through. "There's something I need to tell you," I began, my voice trembling. "Something about my past." Robert listened in silence as I narrated, in a summarized but honest form, what had happened in Riverdale. I didn't go into graphic details, but I didn't omit the essence of the truth. When I finished, I was trembling, my eyes fixed on the ground, afraid to see repulsion or pity in his face. Instead, I felt his hand cover mine, a light touch, respectful of my limits, but present. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said simply. "You are a survivor, Cecilia, and I admire you even more for it." At that moment, something changed between us. It wasn't a grand declaration of love. There were no grandiose promises. Just a mutual understanding, a respect that would form the basis of everything that would come later. Our relationship progressed slowly, at my pace. Robert never pressured, never demanded more than I was ready to give. With patience and gentleness, he showed me that not all men were like my father or Pastor Miller. That touch could be an expression of genuine affection, not of power or domination. Meanwhile, a chapter of the past finally closed. Almost a year after our escape from Riverdale, we received the news. My father had been found in a town in rural Iowa, living under a false name. He was arrested and brought to trial. I was called to testify again, this time in a formal court. It was one of the most difficult experiences of my life, to be in the same room with him again, to feel his hateful gaze as I told my story once more. But this time, I wasn't alone. Mother, Veronica, Carmen, and, to my surprise and gratitude, Robert were there, sitting in the first row, giving me the strength I needed. The trial lasted a week. In the end, the justice I hardly dared hope for finally came. My father was found guilty and sentenced to 12 years in prison. As for Pastor Miller, he had already been expelled from the church after the ecclesiastical tribunal and now awaited his own criminal trial. Leaving the courthouse that day, I felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from my shoulders. It wasn't the end of my healing journey, that I knew would take much longer, but it was a significant milestone. The truth had prevailed. I had been heard, believed, validated. Back in Minneapolis, with the shadow of the trial finally behind us, life began to take on a new rhythm. I finished high school and, encouraged by Robert and Dr. Lydia, I enrolled for entrance exams at the University of Minnesota, dreaming of becoming a teacher. To my surprise and joy, I was accepted. And so, at 19 years old, I began a new phase of my life, no longer defined by the trauma I suffered, but by the choices I was making, by the dreams I was pursuing. Robert was at my side every step of the way, his love and support as constant as a rock amid the turbulence. When I graduated, 4 years later, it was he who was in the first row, applauding louder than everyone. And it was after the graduation ceremony, under the same starry sky of Minneapolis that saw us fall in love, that he knelt and asked for my hand in marriage. I said yes, of course, not because I needed a man to complete me or protect me, but because we had built something beautiful together, a relationship based on mutual respect, understanding, and true love. We married in a simple ceremony, just with close family and friends. It wasn't in a church. I could never enter one again without feeling chills, but in a flowery garden, under the golden light of the setting sun. Mother cried throughout the ceremony, but they were tears of joy. Veronica was my maid of honor. Carmen, now a teenager, helped organize everything. Even August came, bringing his wife and small children. The life that Robert and I built together wasn't perfect. No life is, but it was ours, built on solid foundations of honesty, respect, and love. We had 3 wonderful children, and as I raised them, I promised myself they would never know the kind of fear that had defined my own childhood. When Robert received a job offer in Oakwood, Minnesota, some years later, we decided to accept the change. It was an opportunity for him professionally, and for me, a chance to finally leave the past behind completely, starting in a place where no one knew our story. Oakwood became our home, the place where we raised our children, where we built our lives. And it's here that I am now, at 72 years old, telling this story, no longer as a victim, but as a survivor who found, despite everything, a path to healing and happiness. Life in Oakwood welcomed us with open arms. When we arrived here in the 80s, the town was in full growth. Robert soon established himself in the engineering company, and I secured a position as a teacher at the local school. Our children, Jefferson, Miriam, and Roger, grew up with the freedom I never had, running through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, playing in the backyard of our house, which we bought with so much sacrifice and so much pride. The years passed too quickly. It seems like just yesterday I was changing diapers and telling bedtime stories, and suddenly our children were already graduated, married, building their own lives. Jefferson followed in his father's footsteps and became an engineer. Miriam inherited my love for books and became a university professor. Roger, our youngest, always had an adventurous spirit and today works with ecological tourism. Now, at 72 years old, I live a peaceful and blessed life here in Oakwood. Our house, the same one we bought when the boys were small, got a new color last year, a soft yellow that Jefferson chose during the renovation he insisted on doing for us. The yard continues to be my little paradise, with the fruit trees that Robert planted when we arrived, orange trees, lemon trees, and that generous avocado tree that feeds the whole neighborhood during harvest season. Robert, my life companion for 50 years, doesn't see as well as before. His glasses get thicker, and he complains that the letters in the newspapers get smaller every day. But he still insists on taking care of the yard, pruning the trees and watering the plants with the same care as always. Early in the morning, we are always the first to wake up on the street. While I prepare coffee, strong for him, mild for me, Robert is already on the porch, observing the day dawn and planning his small tasks. Our day-to-day is simple, but full of small joys. After breakfast, Robert goes to the yard, and I take care of the house. It's not as easy as it was before. The joints already complain, the back hurts a little more, but there is a deep satisfaction in keeping our home clean and cozy. Sometimes, when the pain in my hands gets too much, Robert comes and hugs me from behind, saying softly, "Leave that for later, Cecilia. Come rest a bit." And in those hours, I feel that everything was worth it, every tear, every fear overcome, every battle won, to arrive at this moment of simple and true love. Lunch is always a special moment, even when it's just the two of us. I make a point of preparing home-cooked food every day. Robert says my cornbread is the best in the world, and even knowing it's an exaggeration from him, I'm happy with the compliment. Sometimes, Miriam stops by with the kids after school. Our grandchildren, 7 in all, a multiplied blessing, fill the house with noise and life. The oldest is already in college, and the youngest, Roger's daughter, is only 6 years old, a little angel with golden curls who takes after her grandfather. The afternoons are calmer. While Robert takes his nap, I like to sit on the front porch in the rocking chair that was my mother's. I do crochet, despite my fingers not being as agile anymore, and observe the movement of the street. I know each neighbor by name, know their stories, their joys and sorrows. Here, in this little piece of Oakwood, I built not just a house, but a true home. On Wednesdays, we host a group of ladies from church for our afternoon tea and prayers. They are my longtime friends, Mrs. Teresa, who was the first to welcome us when we arrived in town, Mrs. Olga, widowed for 10 years but always with a smile on her face, Mrs. Margaret, who even at 85 still makes the best cornbread in the region, and other ladies who, like me, carry their stories in the wrinkles of their faces and the wisdom in their eyes. We started this group about 15 years ago, when my children were already grown and the house felt very empty and silent. It was Mrs. Teresa's idea. "Cecilia, why don't we have our prayer meeting at your house? You can make that delicious cornbread with apple filling, and we'll bring the tea." And so it began, a tradition we maintain to this day. During these gatherings, we share not just cake recipes, but also life's joys and sorrows. We talk about our children, our grandchildren, the aches that age brings, but also the blessings that each day provides. It's a moment of connection, of feeling that we're not alone on this journey. My faith, which was so deeply shaken in my youth, found a new path over the years. I can't enter churches, the memories are still too painful, But I found God in the small things, in my grandchildren's smiles, in my husband's love, in the kindness of friends, in the beauty of a sunset. It's a simpler faith, perhaps, but also more authentic and personal. Robert has always respected this aspect of my life. He goes to church on Sundays, but has never pressured me to accompany him. Instead, we created our own sacred rituals: a prayer of gratitude before meals, a moment of contemplative silence at the end of the day, a conversation about the blessings received while we watch the stars from our porch. Sundays are special days for us. It's when the family gathers for lunch. Not everyone can come, of course. Each has their own life now. But we make a point of keeping this tradition alive. The table is set with an embroidered tablecloth I received from my mother, the dishes I bought one by one over the years, and the food I prepare with love since early morning. Seeing my children and grandchildren gathered, talking, laughing, sometimes even arguing, because that's what family is like, fills me with a joy I can't explain. I look at them and think about everything I went through, how I got here, and I feel a profound gratitude for having found the strength to break that cycle of abuse and build something completely different for my own family. Not everything is rosy, of course. Age brings its limitations and losses. Many dear friends have already passed away. Mother died 15 years ago, in peace, surrounded by us. Veronica, my sister, who was so fundamental in my life, passed away 5 years ago, leaving a void that will never be filled. Carmen lives in Chicago. We don't see each other as often as I'd like, but we talk on the phone every week. As for my father and Pastor Miller, I haven't had news of them for many years. After serving his sentence, my father completely disappeared. Sometimes I wonder if he's still alive, if he ever felt remorse for what he did. But I don't allow these thoughts to occupy much space in my mind. I learned that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or minimizing the evil that was done, but rather freeing myself from the power that evil had over me. Today, when I look in the mirror, I see a 72-year-old woman with white hair and a face marked by time. But I also see the eyes of a survivor, of someone who knew the worst of humanity and still managed to believe in the best. I see someone who transformed pain into strength, fear into courage, trauma into wisdom. This is me, Cecilia Ann Thompson. I'm not just the girl who suffered abuse in the Church of Riverdale. I'm a wife, mother, grandmother, friend, retired teacher. I'm the lady who makes the best cornbread with apple filling in Oakwood, according to my Wednesday tea friends. I'm the grandma who tells stories to her grandchildren, the neighbor who always has an attentive ear and gentle advice. I am much more than my trauma. And perhaps that is the greatest victory of all. My dear ones who have accompanied me this far, sharing this story wasn't easy. For many years, I carried this secret as a burden too heavy to share. But today, with the wisdom that only years can bring, I understand that our silence only protects the abusers. It's our voices, even trembling ones, that have the power to change lives. If you're going through something similar to what I experienced, or know someone in that situation, I want you to know, you're not alone. The path to healing can be long and difficult, but it's possible. I've learned that age doesn't define our strength, but rather our capacity to begin anew each day. Even when we think there's no more hope, that we're completely broken, we can find strengths we didn't know we had. My wrinkles are maps of survival. Each one tells a story of pain overcome. Looking back, I see that my story isn't about what was done to me, but about how I chose to respond. I discovered that we are stronger than we imagine, especially when we think we can't take anymore. Time doesn't heal all wounds, but it teaches us to live with them and still smile. If there's something I've learned in my 72 years of life, it's that our story doesn't end with the painful chapters. No matter how dark the night, dawn always comes. No matter how deep the well in which we find ourselves, there is always a way out. Sometimes we just need an extended hand to help us find it. In every state, in every town, there are people suffering in silence, as I suffered. People who believe they have no voice, that no one will believe them, that they are alone in their pain. But there are also everywhere people willing to listen, to believe, to help. Seek help. Talk to someone you trust. Look for protection organizations in your area. Don't carry this burden alone, as I carried it for so long. I've learned that surviving is a form of resistance, and living well is the best revenge. Each genuine smile, each moment of true joy, each hug given and received with love is a victory against those who tried to destroy us. Don't let your abuser win by stealing your future too. And if you're on the other side, if you're someone who notices signs of abuse in a child, a teenager, an adult, don't turn a blind eye. Don't do as so many did with me, ignoring the signs because it was more comfortable, because they didn't want to get involved. Your attention, your concern, your support can be the difference between a life of continued suffering and a chance for healing. Dignity and respect are universal values, no matter where you are. Each of us has a role to play in protecting the most vulnerable. Together, as a national community, we can make a difference. We can break the cycle of silence and impunity that allows abusers to continue making victims. My experience has taught me that our story doesn't end with the painful chapters. Today, surrounded by the love of my family, by the true friendships I've built, by the peace I finally found, I can say it was worth fighting for. It was worth believing there was something better waiting for me beyond those walls of the Riverdale Church. Before I say goodbye, I want to make a special request. If this story touched your heart, if somehow it helped you or made you reflect, please show your support. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Each subscription, each comment, each share helps this message reach more people. People who may be going through the same thing I went through and desperately need to hear they are not alone. And if you watched this far, leave the word freedom in the comments, so I know you heard my complete story, and so other people who are suffering can see how many hearts are ready to support them on their healing journey. Do it now. Don't wait even one more minute. Always remember, no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes. Thank you for listening to me. God bless each one of you.